For the implantation of the Ibex Doubleflex, we strongly recommend to use the ErgoCheck injector by Medicel. This injector allows a very controlled, single-handed implantation, has a very large loading chamber, and will literally roll the IOL while it's being pushed through the cartridge. A 2.2 mm injector will work even for the L size of the Ibex Doubleflex. The Medicel ErgoCheck is a visco-free injector and only needs to be lubricated by BSS to develop a slippery inner surface. The surgeon or nurse must, however, administer a drop of methylcellulose onto the optic of the IOL. This prevents the haptics from sticking to the surface of the optic. Without this, the haptics can stick very firmly to the optic and the two elements of the IOL can be very difficult to be separated inside the eye. Sodium hyaluronate, unfortunately, will not reliably prevent this problem. We therefore use hydroxymethylcellulose minims for both lubricating the cornea during surgery and preventing the adhesion of the haptics to the optic during implantation. The first step of the IOL loading process is to make sure the optic is completely in the loading chamber. As mentioned, the loading chamber of the ErgoCheck injector is unusually large, fitting the 7 mm optic without any problem. Even the optic of the L Doubleflex with 7.25 mm diameter fits into the chamber, but with the L size IOLs, a little bit more care is needed to make sure the IOL is completely in the chamber and will not be jammed when closing the cartridge. Next, the person loading the IOL is closing the wings of the loading chamber a little bit. This causes the optic part of the IOL to be bent concavely and the IOL may be less mobile in the chamber. When loading the Doubleflex IOL into the ErgoCheck injector, we found the best solution for the trailing haptic to be folded completely onto the optic of the IOL. This will reliably prevent the trailing haptic from being jammed by the rubber plug of the plunger, a situation which is very difficult to solve when it happens during the implantation. This is best done with a McPherson's forceps or with a push-pull instrument. Because of the two designated flex points at the base of the haptics, this folding works out very nicely. For the leading haptic there are three options. I personally prefer to push the leading haptic a tiny bit into the nozzle of the ErgoCheck just before closing the chamber. This leads to the leading haptic leaving the bevel in a stretched out way, which allows me to guide it very precisely into the capsular bag. However, when doing so, a slight rotation of the injector to the right is often needed during the implantation. Option 2 is to gently pull the leading haptic back towards the optic body before closing the chamber. When doing this, the first haptic will enter the eye in a bent position. This way, no rotation of the injector is usually required to position the unfolding leading haptic correctly into the periphery of the capsular bag. The third option is very elegant as well. The leading haptic can be folded completely back onto the optic exactly like the trailing haptic. Both optics snuggle nicely into the tube formed by the rolled optic when trailing through the funnel of the cartridge and will open like the blades of a Swiss pocket knife inside the capsular bag. This method is recommended particularly for the implantation of the IOL through a relatively small capsular axis because the longitudinal size of the folded IOL is shorter and a hole-in-one implantation is more likely to be successful. After closing the loading chamber and advancing the plunger until it is level with the back opening of the injector body, the loading person or the surgeon can double check under the microscope whether the IOL is folded correctly and exclude that one of the haptics is jammed. If the wheel on top of the injector can be moved easily and the IOL advances smoothly through the cartridge, the IOL is ready for implantation. Since the Medicel ErgoCheck is a unique single-handed screw injector, the implantation can be done under irrigation only. There is no need to fill the anterior chamber and capsular bag with OVD, and this also eliminates the necessity to aspirate the OVD at the end of the implantation. This saves a lot of surgical time and is another major advantage of using the ErgoCheck. It is important to advance the IOL to the very front of the injector only immediately prior to implantation. If the rolled up IOL sits at the narrowest part of the cartridge for a prolonged time, it may get stuck. Therefore, after inserting the irrigation handpiece through the paracentesis, I bring the tip of the injector under the microscope and advance the IOL under visual control until the leading haptic is near the inner end of the bevel. Only then I insert the injector through the main incision. With a 2.2 mm incision, this requires some rotational movement of the injector. After placing the injector tip in the rhexis plane bevel down, the IOL is advanced by rotating the wheel of the injector backwards with the index finger. Depending on the loading method, the leading haptic is placed directly into the periphery of the capsular bag or with a slight rotation to the right and back. The optic unfolds without problems and the trailing haptic opens like a Swiss Army knife. The opening trailing haptic usually slips directly into the bag as well, if the bevel is kept a little bit deep in this phase of the implantation. In case the trailing haptic opens into the sulcus, it can be easily placed into the capsular bag by a slight rotational movement by the IA instrument or the Zinsky hook. Because the implantation has been performed under irrigation, there is only a minimal amount of hydroxymethylcellulose to be irrigated out of the eye before finishing the surgery. Despite the large size of the Doubleflex optic, it is easy to go behind the optic with the aspiration tip in order to polish the posterior capsule if needed. Because there is a large overlap between the optic and the anterior capsule, the IOL is more likely to remain in the capsular bag compared to a normal IOL.